Welcome everybody to On Purpose Live. My name is Jonathan Eaglin. Typically on a Thursday around 6 o'clock, you would see me on Instagram. I've been doing a series of interviews with people, and we've been discovering and talking about purpose. One of the goals has been to talk with people about their lives and how they have taken whatever their vocation is or whatever they've been given to do as their why and making an impact in the world. And so since we've been in the crisis called COVID, I took it upon myself actually God told me to start this podcast once again that I had done a few years ago to talk with people about following their purpose and making an impact to serve humanity. And so those things have been going well. And I was thinking about doing another session, but I had to take a pause. And it was actually my wife. And she said, right now, as we have entered into this time where there's been a lot of change, I would call it. Some people call it unrest, but I call it change. There's a lot of change going on right now. And the topic has been really dismantling and taking a very good look at systemic racism and oppression, especially when it comes to African Americans. Since the death of George Floyd, protests have happened all over the nation and all over the world. And from that, it just sparked a fire in people to start thinking about why this happened in the first place, and really start thinking about structural things and institutional things that have gone on for far too long in this country. And so my wife it was born out of an experience that we were having in our own school. And we started to think really deeply about what would a conversation be like to talk about some of these issues. And so on with us today, we have Dr. Angela Birts, who has spent over 10 years working with schools and organizations to shine a light on cultural awareness and provide them with some solutions to help out with making sure that their staff and their schools could be more inclusive of the experiences of African American people and people of color. So what I want to do right now, I'm going to do my best to get out of the way and let the expert talk and kind of give us some context in terms of this slice of systemic racism, which is on the educational side. And I'm excited to actually have some people joining us via Zoom, parents and possibly some educators. And also we've expanded this out to going live on our Facebook page. So that way, broadly and publicly, people can actually enjoy and participate in this conversation as well. So I want to thank everybody for actually stopping by. I want to also thank some organizations that have been on the ground doing some of the work already, like Street Code Academy and the Green Scholars Program. Despite the challenges that we have around us, these organizations have been able to rise and overcome and provide outlets for African American students to achieve. And also I want to thank the inclusion collaboration with the Santa Clara County Office of Education. They were so kind to share this event on their Facebook page and also on their website. It's so interesting that Angela and I, as we were talking with Angel, it was just part of a discussion. And she was like, we need to use this platform to actually talk more about some of these issues. And I was thinking like, well, maybe we can do it a week later or maybe not. But Angel was like, my wife was like, we need to do this now. And Dr. Birts underscored that we need to do that now because this is actually part of the conversation that we need to have. So I want to encourage listeners to, if you want to drop something in the chat on Facebook, go ahead. We're so privileged to also have some families that are here, families that we have a relationship with who also share some of our experiences as well. They're going to be in the Zoom session with us, and we'll have a section later on where there'll be some Q&A, and then we'll just allow for some really good sharing some time with Dr. Birts so they can talk about some of their experiences She can share some of hers, and then also we can look at some solutions that will move us forward in the conversation. So what I want to do first is talk a little bit about Dr. Birts. I want to shine a light more on her and some of her work. I'll let her dive into her background, but she's a graduate of Lake Forest College in Chicago, and also the Graduate School of Education at Stanford,
Yes.
and then also San Jose State University, where you received your PhD, correct?
EDD.
EDD, sorry, EDD. That's a doctor for educators.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about, and we'll still keep this in the context of purpose, because that's what this really comes down to, how people are using their purpose to impact humanity and serve humanity in productive ways. Tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from,
Mhm.
and then also how you decided, what experiences in life kind of led up to this work.
Thank you. I want to also just start by saying thank you for creating this platform and opportunity for me to have these conversations and share my story. I don't speak on Facebook often, but this is really truly an opportunity to build community. And I didn't want to let this pass me by. So, a little bit about my background. I am from East Palo Alto, California. That's where I grew up, more specifically, the Light Tree Apartments. And I also lived on Azalea. So I grew up having the experience of attending public school. That was my introduction to education. I actually started with the Head Start program in East Menlo Park, and then I attended kindergarten through eighth grade in the Ravenswood City School District. And so, just like many kids in this country, when you're in school, you just do school. There are factors around you that you're not really privy to or you don't think about. So for me, throughout my educational journey, being very young, I was quite fortunate at the time living in East Palo Alto to have African American teachers who taught me about history, more specifically the impact that Blacks have had in this country and even the struggles that Blacks have had. And so that really was my understanding of my racial consciousness and who I am in the context of the world. I would say that overall, my experience in the Ravenswood School District was positive in the teachers that I had that I felt like affirmed me, as well as my family affirming me, of course, and also the friends that I made across different cultures, African American students, Latino students, Pacific Islander students, Fijian students. That's just the type of city that East Palo Alto was. For me, the shift in terms of how I view myself as a student occurred when I transitioned from the public school space to the private school space. So I had a teacher at Menlo Oaks in Ravenswood City School District that encouraged me to consider private school as an option for high school. I never really thought about private school. I didn't know at that time that I was actually in a public school. Again, I was just doing school. Avid reader, the type of student that loved to learn. I guess some could say I was a teacher's pet because I really did enjoy the rapport I had with my teachers and how they challenged me. So it just awakened something in me to think about my life beyond being a student in the Ravenswood School District. What would become of my future? Would I go to college? All these type of conversations. Now, I had relatives in my family that actually were in college, but I still wasn't processing that as an adolescent, that was something that I could actually accomplish. So I make the shift and I go to private school, and that's where I experienced culture shock for the first time. And the irony behind that experience is that I grew up in East Palo Alto and I ended up going to Menlo School in Atherton for high school, which isn't that far away from where I lived. However, it did feel like worlds apart, worlds apart. And just seeing the glaring inequalities that persisted in the school that I attended for high school and the schools that I attended for elementary through middle school, it incited something in me to want more and want to do something about that. But I would say the catalyst for me becoming interested in diversity work was my personal experience as a young Black girl at Menlo School. So, what I did not know, and this is like for people who are listening, particularly who are considering private schools or are sending their kids to private school or any type of school outside of public school, when you go on these visits, you are getting a perception of the school. You can read about it. You can have a really great experience when you're paired with someone that's of color. but it really doesn't prepare you for the experience of showing up to your first class and looking around and not seeing other kids of color. It doesn't prepare you for the experience, in my case, of being a young Black woman and going to the cafeteria and not seeing anyone in my race. That was my second day of school. And really having to process what made that so different than the experience that I had before. And though I had quite a few supportive teachers that helped me, particularly with adapting to the rigor of the school, because it was quite rigorous, to the point where my freshman year, one of my first assignments for English was to write a thesis statement for an essay that I had to write for the book, The Odyssey. And I had never written a thesis statement or been taught that I was writing thesis statements in public school. So that was just a discrepancy that I noticed, like, wow, there's a lot I do not know and I have to catch up. So that part, I had teachers that supported me, and I'm really grateful for that. But when it came to the social experience and the interactions I had with my peers, that was actually the first time in my life where I started to experience discrimination, where I started to question my worth in terms of whether or not I belong there. And quite frankly, I was confronted with stereotypes about my background. Growing up in East Palo Alto, there has been a negative connotation about what it means to be someone that live and exist in that space, such as violence, teenage pregnancy, all those type of stereotypes. And though that's something that did exist and it does exist, it doesn't define the entire city. And it doesn't stop people from doing the things that they need to do to survive and make a difference. So when I was confronted with those type of stereotypes, I was baffled because I really didn't see myself in a deficit lens. Growing up in East Palo Alto, I felt celebrated. I loved my teachers. I loved my friends. Those are the most meaningful memories of my life when it comes to my early childhood education. So to start to experience that at the particular time, being 14 years old, I know it did not feel right, but I didn't necessarily label it a stereotype or have the language to say, I'm experiencing insults or I'm experiencing racial epithets. I didn't have that type of language. I just know that it did not sit well with me and it didn't reflect who I was, those comments and the issues that I had to confront. And I wasn't alone. You know, there were other students of color at the school that were having their own experiences based on their race and gender too, in terms of being a male of color and then a woman of color, right? And so all of that to say the way I dealt with that, number one, by developing a relationship with the school counselor who helped me process the two different worlds I felt like I had to navigate. And then secondly, being a part of clubs on campus where there was an outlet for me to talk about what I was feeling. And not only that, to turn the frustration and the pain that I had into action and thinking about, okay, I'm having this experience, but I also have a voice and I also could speak about what I'm going through. And in the environment that I was in, like many students of color who experience these issues for the first time, the community tends to be very reactive to it and also not really open to understanding that those experiences are actually real. So what I experienced was a lot of just white resistance in that space, and I still felt motivated. So all of that to say, my early education leading up to my experience at Menlo grounds the work that I do, and that passion for wanting to create an inclusive campus or a space for students at different institutions became my mission that I took on in college. At Lake Forest College, I was the president of the United Black Association. I didn't care who you were on that campus. If you were going through something, I would rally behind you because I knew what it felt like not to feel like I actually belonged. And then I just found myself getting involved in organizations that supported me as a young person. College track, I did summer search. I pretty much did every program that was open for low-income students that just afforded me with opportunities. And that really is a catalyst for the work that I do. And so when I speak about it, as we'll talk about on these call and these solutions, yes, I'm speaking from a place of experience, but I also want to just note it's something that I studied intensely. And it's not always easy studying something that you went through when you recognize the gaps in literature and you recognize that your voices still might not be accounted for in institutions in higher education. So my job is just to bridge all of these different worlds based on the different spaces I've had to navigate in order to get to where I am now.
That's beautiful. I mean, as you were talking, there were a lot of different things going on in my mind. as well as listening intently, which is necessary to really fully grasp all the things that you've done, and you beautifully wove it together to give us a good idea of your experience and how that translated into your desire to pursue this from an education standpoint, and then use that experience to actually help someone else, which is the beautiful thing about purpose. The one thing that I thought about as you were talking was that, and this in no way demeans the things that you've done, but the story is almost not unique in a way. And the reason I mention that is because it is a story that is told often by many African American students, not just in this generation, but past generations. On my Instagram page, my stories, I posted a picture of Ruby Bridges. And Ruby Bridges, of course, was 6 years old in 1960, where she had to be escorted by the National Guard to segregated school in Louisiana, right? So that was over, 50 years plus, right, at this point that had to happen. And if you look past that, it was the great fight of even slaves who taught themselves how to read, knowing that education was the path to actually allowing you, freedom in a sense before you were free, right? And so those things have been constantly, structures have been put in place, and a lot of those things continue to exist. You continue to hear stories about students there not being enough Black history in schools, or cultural awareness, or having issues with teachers who don't know their experience. And so that is part of the structure of racism, which we think about sometimes as just bigotry or people somebody mean, but actually permeates its way into a system like education, where it becomes at a deficit to other students. So I'm really excited that the whole tone in the country is being able to shine a light on this area, because I think it presents a great opportunity for change, and for people to listen and implement those changes right away. So that's good. I wanted you to give us maybe a brief, like a snapshot version of maybe some racial inequity. I tried to do a little bit of racial inequity in education, and then bring us to the forefront of today, where we are, and some of the things that you've seen and had to provide solutions for.
So you cover the historical part, but I also want to note just the fact that before the Civil War, it was illegal for Blacks to learn and to pursue an education. And just the fact that education is something that our ancestors had to fight for. And also, even when there were opportunities for us to learn, it was segregated. And though, in 1954, when Brown versus the Board of Education was passed, it was deemed illegal, but we still have to address the fact that many schools are still currently segregated. And 75% of students of color in this country are attending schools where the majority in their schools are their white counterparts from the schools where they are the majority. So to me, that's an inequity within itself. And I recognize that people have different views in terms of the type of education, that's necessary for children. I, for one, do believe that it is something to be said to have cross-cultural interactions and experiences with students from different backgrounds. So that's something that definitely needs to be improved on a systemic level, in terms of students still being driven in schools and public schools based on their zip code, and not having opportunities to explore other options like I had, right? I know some people have, and it's a common story, but the reality is that wasn't the case for all my peers to have an opportunity to go to a private school or to attend a school outside the district, unless they were being bused. And that's a whole nother topic in terms of what those experiences were for students who had to do that. But as we speak about the present state in our country around education, I'm just going to focus specifically on Black children, since this is, the topic that's going on in society right now, and just acknowledge that when it comes to suspension rates, when it comes to access to early childhood education, when it comes to curriculum and teachers who are prepared and effective teaching our children, those are all gaps in terms of equity that we're seeing right now that could hinder a student from being able to accomplish what they need to and live out their fullest potential. And what that looks like, I would say structurally, is that students find themselves in situations where they're not really being pushed, where they are not really being challenged for what they can accomplish, and where they're, quite frankly, some students are passed from grade to grade and they're not prepared for the next grade. And that's a problem within itself. I'm not putting the complete onus on schools because parents play a role as well. However, I am saying that Black students still do have a disadvantage when it comes to receiving a quality education. That's more.
That's what I was gonna. As soon as you said that, I was like, okay, so what do you say to the people who? Because people on both ends will probably say that. Well, if that's the case, then what? Not what is the parent's role, but parents are there. Shouldn't they be doing X, Y, Z, right? So what would you kind of say? And there's a lot of layers to that.
Right.
But if someone interjects that, what is the response that helps them kind of think through? Oh, what, that doesn't make sense.
Well, first, I want to acknowledge that parents have their own experience with this school system in this country. And sometimes that could be a traumatic experience. For others, it could be that they could not finish school for economic reasons or other reasons. So that's something to acknowledge within itself. However, that doesn't stop a parent from being a parent to their child. And even just thinking about when we talked about the historical fact, Black people have always wanted an education, an equal education, and families still want that now. Even with limited resources, parents still strive to be there for their children and help them have the opportunities that they need to succeed. So the role that I see that parent play is being the number one champion for that child and being the number one advocate, because a child can get lost in the system and a child can feel like, some students just become bored when they're not being challenged enough because they are very gifted and have a lot to offer. So the parents do play a role, but I think a paramount role that parents play is around race. And that is up for the parent to decide, but having conversations about race and raising the racial consciousness of children is something that is very important, because when the issues do start to ensue within the school system, kind of how I talked about with my particular experience, you don't always know that you're being discriminated against. You don't always know that you're getting the short end of the stick when you're a young kid. You don't always know that you're being left out of opportunities. So I think the more that parents could talk about their experience in school, whether if you made it through high school, if you made it all the way to your master's, to your PhD, whatever, I think those experience from parent to the child should be told and should be honored. Because I think what it does is that it creates the opportunity for students to recognize this ongoing challenge of having to fight for the education that we deserve. So I say that parents, just as well as schools, play a role in making sure that our students are receiving the education that they deserve.
Yeah, I know that, and the, sometimes with parents, when you think not all parents, like you said, economically are in the same space or have certain levels of education. So when you think about them being able to have access to resources, access to Wi-Fi, when we think about COVID and how it totally just took, many schools weren't able, we were privileged. I mean, being able to pivot to provide hybrid education online, education through Zoom. Some schools weren't able to do that. And if they were, not all parents had maybe a laptop or access to internet or things like that. So it's almost in a way, it's a kind of a blessing in disguise. And I said this before where, we're in a current public health pandemic, which what it did was it exposed another pandemic that's been going on for many, 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 many years. And sometimes it takes something like this for people to actually step up and say, wait a minute, we need to do something about this, because this has been going on for far too long, and we need to actually make some changes within that. So I think it's important to kind of underscore that, and that's another reason why we wanted to have this conversation, was to actually give parents tools, and to equip them so that way, they may not know all they can do to advocate for themselves and advocate for their students, hold administrations and schools accountable and things like that. So I think we'll get a little bit, I don't want to jump ahead too much because I want to give some of the parents in the room an opportunity to speak into that and maybe from some of their own experiences.
I want to add something too before we transition, because you did mention COVID-19, and it is important because this pandemic has exacerbated some of the issues that children were facing before. And more specifically, I would just tell you the number one thing that I was thinking, I really truly hope that Black students aren't forgot about because of COVID. I know that sounds bad, but the fact that I know students were already grappling with issues and having struggles, I just want this pandemic and everything that's going on to kind of propel some of those resources and conversations that need to happen and not curtail them because of COVID-19, because the issues were already going on. So I just want to say that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part that's crucial. And then as soon as, I mean, COVID hasn't ended, but as soon as the tension began to happen with after George Floyd's death, and we begin to have these conversations, now we begin to think about, what are schools going to do, like in response, how do we stand with our families? And of course, even locally in this area, we've seen some things bubble up to the surface, maybe in a negative way, that expose some schools. And of course, we have some parents that may be here that have experienced that. But I think it's one of those things where it's incumbent upon schools right now to not only show support publicly, but where does when that support publicly has to translate into things within curriculum and how they actually provide, not provide solutions, but to work with families and do things differently than what they would normally do in the past.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what has your experience been like so far working with schools and organizations? What are some of the things you do when you're called in to work with them? And then how is like the response to your work when you're working with schools and organizations?
That's a really great question. So I've been independent in terms of working with the company I started, Birts Equity and Inclusion Solutions, LLC, was really my way of wanting to branch out and support schools from different types of backgrounds. So currently I've worked with a lot of public and charter schools. I have yet to work with a private school. And often when I am called upon, it is out of an experience that a child is having, but sometimes it's also out of the awareness that teachers and administration have in terms of the gaps and the deficiencies around cultural understanding and around their proficiency in DEI work. But also recognizing that DEI has become such a buzz and people are leveraging that. You have to do diversity work, or we have to start working on these issues because everyone is doing it. Now, I will say I'm very particular in terms of what I sign up for and the type of projects that I take on, because I really am truly interested in investing in schools and organizations that want to do the work. And because I served in a role as a director of diversity of inclusion at Menlo School for 6 years, I know that change does not happen overnight. It has to be incremental change, and it has to be something that's steadily worked at. So I take more of a long-term approach. So with many of my clients, I work with them anywhere from 6 months to a year. And that consists of addressing the education that has to happen per constituency group, right? So there's education that happens for teachers, but there's also education that happens at the senior admin level or at the executive level and so forth. And it is important to draw those distinctions because there are dynamics involved. When you're training and you're talking to individuals that are staff that have their own experiences that they need to talk about in terms of their identity and what they're dealing with, as well as gain skills to be more successful at what they're doing. It's not always beneficial to initially have everyone in the same room where those dynamics persist. And some people could be afraid or not feel very comfortable to speak their truth because their boss is in the room. So that just creates more work, which means it's more time. So some of the things that I've seen with the clients that I've worked with, they have been eager to do the work. Hence, that's why they reached out to me. Hence, that's why they put forth the resources and the money to make it happen. And I'm starting to realize that there are tiers into different people that I'm working with. When I enter an organization or a school, I'm meeting people who have experienced this themselves and they've done a lot of work in the area. Then other people they've read books, they've watched documentaries, they're educating themselves. They feel woke sometimes, but they also recognize, what does that mean, like tangibly? What does it mean in terms of my management or as a supervisor? Or if I'm working in marketing, this letter I'm going to put out, or if I'm trying to engage more individuals in a social impact, what does it look like to connect with people across different places? So all of that to say that long-term approach is something that I advocate for. I'll do a workshop here and there where I touch on bias and so forth, but I'm really interested in making culture shifts, and I'm really interested in bringing healings in communities where people have really been impacted by injustice, microaggressions, and so forth. And that just takes a lot of work and a lot of commitment. So those are the type of people I love to work with, because it's arduous work, and I don't expect a person to change after one workshop. I don't expect them to change after a workshop or a seminar or a webinar.
Right. Think about the workshops. I'm thinking about the workshops that I've been to, and it can be a lot condensed in a lot of time. And some of those nuggets I'll take, but it takes time of follow up and consistently going through it. I want to talk a little bit about, and you mentioned this earlier, and I definitely want to acknowledge the healing of communities and work and things like that. And also, I know that one experience that I share with a lot of people, which you mentioned, bias. And so maybe we can talk a little bit about like implicit bias, especially when it comes to like teachers. When I growing up, I went to a magnet language school, and we had kids busting from all over, but most of the teachers, I had a few African-American teachers, but most of the teachers were white female teachers. And I know that that's a lot of it, that is a shared experience of a lot of Black children. I think there's some type of percentage that we looked at of the number of white female teachers.
Over 70% now.
Over 70%, right? So that's the framework that a lot of children have. And if they don't have the awareness from a cultural perspective, sometimes those biases come in and they play out in the classroom. So maybe talk about that. Maybe somebody's listening out there who has heard the word, but is maybe unsure about how it manifests, so that way they can hear it and say, oh, that's what that is, and maybe I need to change.
Yeah, so implicit bias for me is simply beliefs and ideals that you have about an individual that you're sometimes unaware unconsciously, that it impacts the way that you see that person before you even know anything about them. And it does show up in the experiences in the classroom. It shows up with race, but it also shows up with gender and race, the intersection of those two, particularly with Black males as well. And when it comes to what's deemed bad behavior or poor behavior in comparison to what's acceptable in terms of how children express themselves. But it also shows up in terms of beliefs. Do you actually believe that this student that you're working with is capable of succeeding? Now, I know in my lifetime as an adult that people that I care about have come to me and share that I had some teachers that didn't believe that I would make it. I always knew that I would make it, but that really struck me to know, wow, some people really didn't think that I would be able to, not survive, but thrive in an environment that would set me up for my future. So I know that people have it and they aren't aware of it. And the most important thing is, what do you do when it comes to the surface? What do you do when someone brings it to your attention that you have this bias and you may not believe that you have it? What are the action steps that you're going to do to dismantle those so that you're not hindering someone from getting the services and the support that they need? When I think of public schools specifically, I recognize that when it comes to getting students into college, there aren't very many college counselors. There's like 1 or 2 college counselors for over 100 students. But even just thinking about how flawed that is, can you truly set students up who want to go to college, or even have conversations with students who aren't considering college when you have just a disproportionate number of staff that are working on those particular issues? But I hear stories all the time of individuals saying that they were told they could never apply to X college, they would never get in. You can't have that type of job. You cannot go for that. That's implicit bias when people are telling you that, because it's unwarranted, number one, and you really can't determine what a person's future is going to be. And the best thing to do is affirm people in the limited time that they're around you or in your life, because they're not going to be there forever. So affirm them, then go into that, you know, that space of doubt and uncertainty about who a person can be. And so I think addressing those head on is a great way to ameliorate a lot of the issues that stem from it, that precede that, in terms of how that translates into action toward kids or action toward people.
Yeah, it really underscores the power that teachers have with their students. I can remember, I think it was Malcolm X, when he was in grade school, and I think he mentioned the type of career that he wanted to have, and the teacher was like, "No, you can't do that." And it really just it kind of shut down. I mean, obviously he wanted to do great things, but I think about that with the power that a teacher has, and it really it speaks to, you know, having more African American teachers, you know, more African American male teachers. Not to say that other teachers won't do that, but be able to have those people in a place where I remember my teachers that were Black, and I remember, you know, outside of their teaching, I knew that they were rooting for me, you know, to succeed, rooting for that's why they were so hard on us to succeed and actually, you know, move forward and get better. So I think we're at the.
I got to ask something because it came up. Because I'm processing as you were saying that. I think a distinction in my experience with my Black teachers, I don't think they looked at themselves as being my savior. And I think that is something that has to be addressed, because you can sort of support a kid, but you don't necessarily have to do it in a way where you're focused on getting the credit or the recognition for it. And it has to come from an authentic place. If you are going to gravitate towards students and really try to encourage them to live out their dreams or expose them to different opportunities, there has to be some humility that comes with that. And the focus should remain on the child and what the child needs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's very good. Good. If anybody is on Facebook, feel free to, there's a function called a watch party. So if you want to amplify this talk to your network and your friends, go ahead and do the watch party, and everybody can watch what you're watching, which is this live. So thank you so far for everyone who's joined with us. And this has been great. I think there's a lot in education. There's a wide variety of areas that you can go into, from higher education, right? Yesterday, there was a movement called Shut Down Academia, to shine a light on the systemic racism that is present in higher education. Faculty members, students of color going into schools largely where there's not students of color, and really kind of help people reflect on those things. Private, public education, there's a lot of different ways that you can focus on that. And I think where we're driving is to really think about the whole system, but to also on a smaller level, looking at, you know, children, maybe grade school going up to high school. Those are some of the earlier years where a lot of that influence is happening. And so what I want to do right now is open up the discussion to some friends of ours and people that we've invited to come on the Zoom, because I think through those real experiences, we'll be able to kind of hear people's hearts, where they're coming from, what they've experienced as children, but even years later, their children are experiencing now. And then Dr. Birts providing them with some real-time solutions and ways that they can engage to have a better and a productive relationship with the schools, if you can have a relationship with the school, and then really hear their heart. So I think I'm going to try to bring everybody into the room here. So I'm going to go exit screen. And so we have.
Hey, while we're doing that, John. Hi, Angela.
Hi, Angel.
Hey.
Angel is managing the room. She's doing such an amazing job. I take no credit for that.
Hey, everybody. While we're doing that, while folks are coming in the room and getting their questions ready, we do have some questions on Facebook that I'd like to just point your attention to. We have, I believe her name is Atzri. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Atzri asked to you, Angela, what is your number one tip about shifting culture? what would be like your number one tip about culture shifting?
It starts, I'll just say an inside outside approach. It has to start with identity first, meaning creating spaces for people to talk about who they are in the context in which they work. Furthermore, their positionality, what position do they serve in society? That's where it starts.
Great. Any more questions on Facebook, Angela?
We have some comments on Facebook. One comment came from Marcella. She said, private schools need your help. Curtis Monetti said, sometimes parents don't have the tools to facilitate the child's education because the parents' educational experiences were subpar. And Karen Lyon said, not just teachers though, administrators too. Teachers affect one room, administrators affect change on a wider level.
No, I agree with that. Well, addressing, I'll start with the second one around not just teachers, administrators. Definitely.
And then Angela, maybe you can speak a little bit into to piggyback on that in terms of policy a little bit as well, because I know your background is in policy, because that affects what administrators obviously do too.
Right. So addressing that part with the administrators, that's a conversation I believe is more effective to have with administrators to do the work, because they are in charge of writing policies. They are in charge of creating those shifts that needs to happen in structures and so forth. So that's why I express thinking about it in terms of different constituent groups. So just as teachers have biases, so do administrators and leaders as well. And conversations and having them unpack that through the lens of thinking about what does it mean when you are in a position of power and when you are the broker of culture and when you are someone who's in a position to shift policy and practices to accommodate the needs of individuals. Absolutely, that type of training and that type of conversation has to happen at that level. And to Curtis' point, I agree with that wholeheartedly. Some parents don't have the tools, or some parents weren't prepared to just take on the arduous task of getting students through a school system that is broken. Excuse me. And I'll talk about it later when we get to more solutions, but having spaces where parents come together and share resources around what's working with their child, or just leveraging the support of the village, becomes vital in those particular scenarios.
Yeah, and I think it's also great to highlight some of the work with parents and families to lean into nonprofit organizations and organizations that exist outside of the school. I know even right now, Street Code has a campaign to provide students with laptops, right? So if you have a laptop that you're not using, you can donate to them, and they're trying to get a tool for access in the hands of students. Or you have other organizations like even our faith community, New Beginnings, going out and working with schools to help raise funds and to help clean up classrooms and to really provide an opportunity where they can see that the community is coming together and that parents are not alone in these processes. So I think are we ready to go to the room, Angel?
We actually had a question from someone inside the room.
Okay, great.
Someone wanted to know, Angela, you were talking about how you mainly go into schools and how you are working with administrators and teachers in those environments. But someone had a question and wanted to know, do you work with corporate too?
I have not worked with corporate yet. Yes.
Is it your focus now? Your focus is to work within the educational system to look at change there?
I'm open to corporate, but I'm going with where the need is. And it just so happens that nonprofits and the educational space are the people who contact me for my services.
Good. Well, I'm hoping someone from corporate can, because corporate have their own education.
Absolutely, yeah.
Embedded within. And so I think that from that standpoint, you know, employees have children, right? Being able to go where they are and to provide them resources. I mean, if it's in the D&I space and you're talking about from a corporate level, dealing with employees and hiring and things like that, that's one thing. But also being able to speak to employees readily about, you know, how to work within their schools, I think that there's a need for that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone is already in the room. Uh-oh, wait a minute. I'm not doing a breakout room. Gallery view. All right. So we have in the room with us right now a few families. We have the Andos. I hope I'm okay with calling you guys out by name. Berkeley's raised a hand. Okay, so we have our friends Damaran and Wakita Berkeley, and a few of the families, we know each other from track and other school experiences. And so I'm so glad that you were all able to come on and share some of your experiences and get a chance to interface with Dr. Birts. We've been working with her for some time, and I'm excited about the work that she's doing. I'm excited about this time where we are now, and being able to provide some solutions and actually hear from you all. I think it's always good to hear stories and hear people's experiences, so that way they can connect on a heart level, and then hear about some of those solutions that we can provide to deal with some of those things. So I think the Berkeleys have raised their hand. Do I need to? I'm not going to lower their hand. Okay.
We're good to go.
All right. Well, first of all, I just want to say good evening, Jonathan and Angel. Thanks so much for providing this opportunity for us to have this conversation. Thank you, Dr. Birts, as well. It's an honor to be in your presence and to have you here speaking with us, because we are Black parents here in the Bay Area, the Peninsula specifically. And listening to you talk, I appreciate your sharing that you are from the area, grew up in EPA. Our experience is a little different. We have 3 children, elementary, middle, and high school. And my husband and I grew up in the South. We are transplants here to California. And of course, our concern is for our children to have that feeling of being affirmed. So we've been intentional about trying to create a village of people who look like us, to kind of be that source of affirmation. But my question is, with them attending schools where they are the only Black children in their classes. I mean, there are some kids of mixed race, but the differences in hair texture, skin tone, having 2 girls and a young boy, I mean, there's a lot that goes on. Some things go completely over their heads. They may not even realize that people are saying things that are offensive to them, or maybe they do, and they don't want to be that one person who is speaking out to defend themselves. But that whole being an adolescent and not wanting to be different from the group, the peer pressure is real. So what would your advice be to parents who are being intentional about how they're raising their children, but also being able to help them deal when they're in situations where people are making jokes or comments or saying things that are offensive? How do you teach them to speak up for themselves, or at least feel like it's okay to report that, but not put themselves in a situation where they're kind of ostracized? Like, I don't know if that's clear, but just trying to figure out how to navigate that. Thank you.
Of course. Yes. So first, I completely understand what you're saying, because I encounter parents all the time that are transplants to the Bay Area and are struck with the lack of diversity, and particularly the percentage of Black students in schools. That's just the reality right now, that there aren't very many Black students in the different schools. So students literally end up being one out of the few in the entire school. And to answer your question more specifically about what do you do when your child starts to talk about what's happening at school, I do want to say that sometimes, I don't know the conversations you had with your child. I would also say just monitoring their mood as well, because if it isn't spoken about, it could show up in other ways in terms of a student retreating or doing things that's out of the norm. That could also be underscore possible issues that's going on in school that have to do with race. One other thing I would say is knowing who your allies are on your child's campus. Allies come in all types of forms. It sounds like, I don't know what the percentage of faculty of color are at your school, but even if it isn't a faculty of color, just identifying a teacher or two that you trust on that campus. And I would also say not even limited to a teacher. There are people who serve in staff roles within a school who monitor children, who are there for other people's children as well, whether if it's the assistant at the front office or it's a coach or someone. But knowing who those people are and starting to develop connections with them, that's very helpful because it could give you an opportunity to keep your eyes on the ground when you're not there. With your child, I would say document every single experience that pertains to race, that seems fishy, that doesn't feel right with your soul. And what I mean by document is literally keep a list of it in terms of the date, what happened, and what emotion your child felt. Because the challenge with being in a school where there aren't very many people of one race, it could seem, if a parent were to come forward or a child, it could come across to administration sometimes, or even teachers, well, that's a one-off experience, or that's just an anecdote that doesn't happen here, or this is just one child in our entire school, everyone else is doing well. So the more documentation that you have around that experience is important. And always, just my opinion as someone that's been in an administrative role before, always reach out to school leadership and report it each and every time. Not just a meeting, but also have that documented in writing. And after every meeting that you have, always follow up with an email to highlight what you discussed in the meeting and any action items that will come out of the conversation that you had. So every single time that it happens, I would say discuss it, share it, and report it, because it is important. And what it does, it could incite other families or children who are having a similar experience, but it could also open up administrators' eyes that they have a problem, and they might not otherwise see it that way, because sometimes parents do not come forward. And related to that, I do want to express for children who are on scholarships, or for children who are coming from low-income backgrounds in certain spaces, sometimes they don't want to speak up out of fear of retaliation. So that's something to note as well. So when parents do talk about those, it's very courageous, and it does create more opportunities for those stories to come forward. And those stories, I believe, has to come to the surface in order for any change to happen. And I just want to acknowledge whatever it is that your child has gone through, because I know it isn't easy. And I just, I support you and encourage you to just have those conversations and don't give up.
And thank you, Berkeley's, for sharing that. I mean, it's not unique. I mean, we've experienced, we've been out here, Jonathan is 11 going on 12. And for every year that he's been in school, we've had to deal with something in regards to, related to something that you're talking about. We can go on and on, being at the school, talking to administrators. So it's something that happens ongoing. So I wanted you mentioned, Angela, about allies. I know this term is now being tossed around a whole lot. It's becoming a buzzword. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that and could possibly help someone. What does a true ally look like? And then how does, because you may be thinking that someone is supporting you, but they may not all the way totally support you. And especially in that environment, you want people there to actually support you, to help you through some of these issues.
Mm-hmm. It's someone who stands up for someone that's marginalized. And it's more so about what's happening when you're not in a room as much as what a person is saying to you. And sometimes those messages are conveyed through your child, and you may not recognize that's pretty much what your child is telling you, in terms of when they come home and start to talk about someone that they trust, or someone that made them feel affirmed, or someone that, just shares something with them based on their interest and their gifts that they have. Those are people who could possibly be allies for you and your family. In terms of like going to parent-teacher conferences and the phone calls that you have with the teacher, engage in who you can trust. I will say parents, use your judgment in that, and that parent intuition sometimes is really right around who you could be open with and who you cannot be open with. But when you do find someone that you trust, and that you also know that when you have conversations, it doesn't fall on deaf ears, but one indication is if you do open up about an experience that your child had, and you share that with someone on campus, I don't want to limit it to a teacher, but any type of ally, an ally is more inclined to come back to you and ask you how you're doing. How is your child doing? They'll follow up. They might even take it upon themselves to start to work on addressing it for the child, even when you're not in the room. But I think that follow-up is usually a great indication for someone that's a champion for you and your child when you're not around to do that for yourself. But that follow through is really important. Does a person take the responsibility on their own to try to make change and have difficult conversations with their colleagues or with their supervisors? Or do they just reach out to you or start to contact you and ask you simply, how is it going? This happened 3 weeks ago. How is your child doing? That sort of thing.
Good. Well, I want to also acknowledge if there's anyone on Facebook that maybe has some questions and give some space for that. Do we have any questions on Facebook?
Not at this time, but I actually have a question. And you mentioned, Angela, when you're going into schools, when you do go into schools, is there ever a time where you encounter denial? And if and when you do encounter that, what are some of the ways that you've helped to work to bring awareness in those situations?
Yeah, so I've had a really unique experience that I actually really like in terms of going in to be a researcher and an investigator. So that's really important because when I have been in schools, I've actually had an opportunity to interview and talk to these different constituents groups and then also talk to leadership. So I'm really truly gaining a full range of experiences and perspectives. And of course, anonymity is important, but what that does is it gives me leverage to speak to some of those experiences that people are actually going through. In terms of when the denial has come up, is very subtle. Again, if someone is investing to bring you in to get work done, part of them has already recognized there's a problem or an opportunity for growth. So that's slightly different than what I've been experiencing. It could just be, I recognize in people just feelings of guilt, trying to decipher between, am I being celebrated in this moment, or is my performance under question based on this feedback that I'm receiving? And that's more so of what I've seen recently. But I would say the denial is, I've seen that in my experiences, especially I go back to that point in terms of representations where there aren't very many children, especially Black students in the school. The denial is really real about the experiences that students are having. I actually did research on this topic as it pertains to private schools because my dissertation focused on the racial identity development of Black students who attend private schools in the Bay Area. And I looked at how they're socialized racially in the home, but I also looked at how school sites themselves serve as a place where they develop their racial identity. So in that experience, I do have examples and I have seen where administrators and teachers were in denial about the experiences that students were having. That's over 200 pages if anyone wants to read it, but particularly around, a deep dive and a deep look into those issues, it is worth taking a look at, particularly for that private school space.
Good. I want to, and I'm going to jump over to Shelly in a second if she has a question, but I also want to highlight the Berkeleys for, they went out and protested in front of I think it was it St. Francis, I believe. I know that there's been a few schools in the news and for some of the things that have happened there. And I'm only bringing that up to say that when we think about, how students are being socialized in schools and then what they actually have to deal with while there, and now with a light being shined on systemic racism in schools, and these schools having an opportunity to own some of the things that are going on in the school. I know that there was a few students who did some things that were not, I think it was a few students in blackface, and that it was not a good situation. So do parents, what do they do in that situation? Do they pull their kids out of school? Do they work with the administration? What, you know, how do you navigate that space when these things are happening?
Advocating for education in terms of education of the school about history, about racism, about everyday microaggressions that really do take a psychological toll on students of color. I think education is the chief cornerstone to resolving and eradicating a lot of what we're seeing. And I am seeing that people are starting to look at stuff that myself and either my former colleagues and even my friends have suggested for years, and they're finally starting to take a look at it, which is really great. And that could create an opportunity for individuals to leverage with their children, to leverage in their homes, in meetings and so forth. But pulling a student out of school, it's interesting because I cannot necessarily say I could tell you another school that if a child were to change and shift to another school, that they would not experience some of those same things. So I would say rallying around other parents to talk about how can we create professional learning opportunities for adults in the community, and how do we create education for students as well. Again, I'm going to emphasize not a day, not a particular session, not a workshop, ongoing education that's embedded in the fabric of the curriculum, as well as designated times where communities come together to learn. That's something that I would say could be a short-term solution to have an impact. And getting that in writing, and also thinking about different iterations of what that will look like over an extended period of time, 5 years, 7 years, and so forth, but knowing when going forward and making those decisions to have those conversations to say, this is something we want to see in writing. What would this look like over the course of 5 years for us to bring someone in to work on this particular issue, for us to bring someone in to address the curriculum. And I also want to recognize that you do have individuals within school that have been relentlessly working on a lot of these issues, and they have been having an impact. And sometimes I don't believe that the light is cast on them either. And I also recognize that the fatigue that comes with that for faculty of color who take on that type of role is something worth noting. But doing an audit around what's already happening, because sometimes there are things that are happening in terms of conversations around race, but they're done in silo, and even at the board level, and they might not be privy to what some of these teachers are in the classroom doing. A parent might not be privy to it. Some students go home and you ask them, how is school? And they're like, oh, it was fine. You would have no idea what happened in the classroom unless you really pressed them to talk about it. So I think I go back to that training and that research and getting an audit of the school that you're in to figure out what are the things that are working well when we talk about race relations, and what are the things that are not working well. How do we build on and sustain what a few group of people are doing well, and then how do we create more opportunities where there are gaps in terms of what needs to happen.
Absolutely.
And I was just gonna say, Angela, you hit it right on the nail. It's like my question was gonna be, what do you say to the student or the child that has, been inundated with this, from elementary all the way through high school, and to the point where, it's become, very just common, with them being called names, or just the inequity, maybe even in how they're being assigned classes, things like that. It's very common now where I will hear on any given day, that's okay. This happened, but that's okay. That, they're becoming desensitized to it. What do you say to those students?
I'm gonna have to bring up the N-word, because that's what came to mind as you were speaking. Because that's where I hear students just like brush it off, and they always talk that way. They always joke about that particular thing. I'm called this, insulting word, but that's okay. Educating them on why it's not okay, and what is the meaning behind those words are very important, and how those words in particular have been used to criminalize, beat, and kill people. Some people just don't have that educational background when these different type of conversations are coming up around the impact of what they're silently agreeing to. And sometimes students are doing because they do want to fit in. They don't want to become ostracized. They don't want to be the only child of color that speak up and say that hurt me or that offended me. So they go with the status quo. The research shows that cumulatively, when it happens over time, it does take a psychological toll. So I personally have always been the one to push back and just try to facilitate a conversation with the child around what's their understanding about what they're passively accepting into their psyche and what they're accepting into their life, because that's actually what's happening. And that could turn into internalized oppression, self-hate, and all these other things. But a child might not necessarily know when they're being exposed on that level that could impact them as a teenager or as an adult, from not being able to talk about and process, those ouch moments or those demeaning words that they have to receive over and over again. But I'm not a believer of dismissing them. And I'm also an educator at heart. So education is a way to invite a student into that space, to challenge them to think about it a little bit more deeply. Does it change the behavior? Not always, but does it inform someone? Yes. And the knowledge piece is important.
I think one of the things that's different, thank you, Dr. Birts. I think one of the things that's different now is that, and this is what the protests are highlighting, is that we, African Americans for years have tried to work on themselves and all the things that they can do to support their students and their parents. And we've had to, jump higher and run faster and learn more. I think what the protests are showing us is that there's some accountability on the part of the people in power who have the opportunity or have had the opportunities to make significant changes. And now there's really no more excuses to say, well, I did not know, or I did not have the resources. You're a resource. There's tons of resources out there to implement. I don't understand. And I do understand, but I think the Berkeley's even mentioned having, more Black studies. I can't understand why in 2020 that you're at a school and the only history that you're learning is either ancient Rome or India or different things. And even though there may not be a large population of African-American students there, all of those students need that perspective as well. So I think the shift that we're experiencing right now, I'm excited about that because, now there's the accountability is at a point where others have to do something about it to combine with the work that we've always been doing.
And some people need support in doing that. Because even if a person or an educator agrees with that, that doesn't come easily for some teachers as it might for another teacher. So thinking about if you are going to teach literature, if you're going to expose students to all these culturally relevant topics in education, what type of support is in place to help people navigate those conversations? Exactly. Because when you go there, you're going to have to go there because conversations are going to ensue that's beyond your control. And these ready responses of responding in the moment become vital as we start to it's already happening in certain classrooms. I cannot emphasize that enough, that type of learning is already happening in certain classrooms, but where people are willing to accept it and embrace it and start to teach it or lead discussions or bring it at the board level or bring it in their different spaces, teaching people to become adept to handling the conversations that come up when you start to talk about it. And I'm saying still talk about it, but also recognize it's an arduous task. And it is for a person of color who has to talk about it too, because as a person of color, me as an individual, I've dealt with, do I have a special agenda because I'm Black if I'm talking about something? That's a layer that a person who's not of color might not ever have to deal with.
That's good.
We have a question here on Facebook. Thanks, Dr. Birts. Karen Lyon is asking, if you see these microaggressions, and I don't ever want to assume that everybody understands what a microaggression is. The question is, if you see these microaggressions in a college, how should that be handled? I'm speaking as a white teacher trying to help other white teachers understand how their own bias gets in their way.
Okay. Well, I do want to acknowledge, to your point, Angel, perhaps some people, you know, we use term and language, right, when we're talking about diversity stuff. But when we start to speak about microaggressions, macroaggressions, and so forth, it is forms of discrimination. It is the subtle comments. It is the treatment that people receive that make them feel inferior or make them feel like they're not included, sometimes really subtle. When we talk about racism on the student level, there's a systemic part of it, but there's also the everyday experiences that people are dealing with. So
Right.
for, what's her name again?
Karen.
For Karen, when she sees it, I mean, if she recognizes it, that's an opportunity to own the environment that she's in, to address it head on. Even if she doesn't even know what that looked like, just calling it out to say that language you use, I want to challenge you to think about, you know, the meaning behind those words. This is where at the college level, setting very high expectations in the beginning in terms of norms around what it means to engage in philosophical conversations around race and so forth, and holding people to a set of, whether if it's cultural competency skills, different skill sets that they have to utilize when they're talking and interacting with people. That's an opportunity to have accountability for those students. It's different if, you know, a student came to you, Karen, and said, this happened to me, and you weren't privy to it. That's still another opportunity for you to address it. I remember a particular experience I had in high school where one of my classmates, we had to complete an assignment when we interview different populations of people. And she allegedly, you know, said that she interviewed a homeless guy, and this homeless man was African American. But when I was in the classroom and I heard it, I just knew in my soul that that was not the voice of an African American person. So I just was like, you know, investigating and really paying attention. And I don't remember if I asked her, if I heard her telling someone else that she made that up, and she made up the story. And I went to the teacher and I told my teacher, and my teacher, she addressed it head on with the class. She didn't say who told her, but she addressed that. And I think that's an opportunity to address something, you know, that comes up. Some people are going to be more vocal and say, like, I'm just going to tell that person myself. But other times you do have that opportunity to go back to the class. Delay does not mean it's a bad thing, right? If it happened at a particular time of the day and you cannot address it, I actually implore you to put thought into it and think about how to address it. But those are all learning experiences for everyone that's involved. And reaching out or talking to other people in departments to prep yourself or talk it through is just a way of learning. I even did that as an individual, just always talking through different scenarios because it's so sensitive. So that would be my advice on addressing those microaggressions, however they're received, either in person, you see it as a leader and you see it going down, or someone came and told you after the fact. Both examples still should be addressed.
She also mentioned that kind of what you're speaking to. She said, how should a teacher deal with it from a parent volunteer? I had a former student who had to deal with this situation. When I tried to speak up, I wasn't heard. So
a parent volunteer essentially was perpetuating.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Having a conversation with that particular parent and talking to if it's a room full of students, you still have to have a conversation because the impact is felt. If it's an individual student, and I would even say the key word is volunteer. That person doesn't have to continue volunteering if they're not upholding the dignity and the worth of the children that they're, or whoever helping, or that role that they're in, right? Yeah. That's an honor to work with different type of people, even if it is in a volunteer capacity. So it could also come down to having the conversation, addressing it, and then finding another volunteer if that's an option.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that question on Facebook. I want to go back into our room and talk with Shelly Ando down in Southern California. Hey, Shelly, how are you?
Hey, guys. Hey, Eaglins. Thank you, Dr.
Hey.
Hi, Shelly.
Hope everyone's doing well.
Yeah, we're doing well. So Dr. Birts, thank you again for just being open to having this conversation. I think conversations like this have to be ongoing. It can't just be in the heat of the moment because we're all, at a heightened sense of urgency, right? We've all reached the tipping point. I think we've got to continue to have these conversations. And I've got 3 children, 2 boys, 1 girl. My boys are older, so they're starting to become more aware of what's happening to them and the biases that they are experiencing. So I'm actively going to administration. I'm actively talking to teachers to address it. But being in Southern California in a small conservative town, they're not really open to having those discussions. So do you have tips for parents who experience like the pushback from administration?
Yes. So first, I don't know the demographic of the school, but if there are other parents, to create a network to have those conversations, because the first thing I'm thinking about is the self-care part. And actually, because if it comes down to waiting on administration, then the needs might not be met, but the administration I will address. But like the immediate need is rallying around, your kids to talk through some of those things. And sometimes it's helpful to have a few other parents and a few other students, even if they're not at that same school, to be a part of that type of conversation, because more than likely their children could experience it too. But what it does is it can create a sense of community for your children with other students, regardless of where they are, that theirs are actually friends that they could reach out to when they are experiencing stuff. And sometimes, kids have a way of telling the parent, and the parent's going to end up telling you anyway if you weren't already privy to it. But just creating a network of support. When it comes to the administration, I mentioned like documenting those type of things that come up is really important. And this is something that's overlooked often, but every organization, corporation, school has a mission statement. And sometimes, we receive a handbook when you work somewhere, you have this experience, but I'm looking at the mission statement and the values that are espoused online and marketing and all of that. That is really a good leverage point to begin to have a conversation to say, if I'm reading this mission statement of the school that my child attends, and how is this school living up to what they're saying in the mission statement and values, and where are the discrepancies? Because to me, that's an entry point, just to point back to that mission statement to say, this school says it does X, Y, Z. Well, it's not for all students, because my child isn't afforded that same opportunity to have that because they are getting discriminated against. So I would say leveraging that mission statement, and sometimes mobilizing to have that conversation with other people before you go to admin, or maybe you went multiple times and nothing has been done, and really getting people to think about it. And I would say right now is a time to start to reimagine what some of those statements, mean anyway, or what should they become now, because so much has changed. And so that's just an opportunity right there within itself. But I would say that could be one way. I would also say, knowing within your network or being a part of conversations like this, and when you hear from people who do diversity work, or you hear from other schools who brought in someone in whatever capacity to do that type of work, sending that information over to administration as well to say, I know people in this situation and they've worked with this individual, and this is someone that I want you to have a conversation with. So it's really really different ways to go about it. But I just want to speak to the power of the mission statement, and how that really is an opportunity to think about how your children experiences fare in comparison to what the schools say that they do for the students.
Thank you, Dr. Birts. Thank you, Shelley, for that question.
I want to add one important thing,
yeah.
Shelley. If you find yourself in a position where you start to meet with these other parents frequently, and you're having these conversations and these same issues are starting to come up, I would say just keeping receipts, like figuratively and literally. Like you're spending money, you're feeding people, just like documenting actually what does it take to build solidarity to support students. And because that's all like data eventually that you could use if it were to become institutionalized, to have some sort of parent group for Black families or other racial ethnic groups that the school support and that the school affirm. So even keeping documentation on that level of how many people were in the room, what the impact was, change in behavior, of the change in your child's spirit when those conversations happen. How much money did you have to spend? When did it occur? All of that type of stuff being documented could be something that's very helpful too.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. It's tiring, but I guess we just got to keep doing it if we want to see change.
Yeah, it is. I acknowledge it is. It becomes exhausting. It does.
Yeah.
It does.
I agree with you both. Yeah. I mean, Angel and I, at a certain point, I guess the only thing the thing that keeps us moving forward, of course, is our faith. But then also knowing that, these are our kids, right? And that doesn't take away from the feelings of, exhaustion and being tired. That just lets you know the gravity of the situation. And I'm glad that you all are here so that way we can share these stories and we can affirm one another and we can provide resources that hopefully that can turn into some results that we can look back on and say, we pushed through. We took advantage of this opportunity to put pressure on administration and teachers and schools and even ourselves, to enact some type of change. And as I talk about results, I want to also highlight that I think even locally here in the Bay Area, as some of that very disturbing news came out of some of the schools, that in response to that, there were groups that came together to actually work with the administration to make some change that is actually taking place from not really perspective, but a policy level, things being put in place to actually address some of those issues. I was able to look on Facebook and see some of the parents, students there encourage that, through having these conversations, some which have been had in the past, but now they're really being amplified and sped up, that some of these things are actually moving in the right direction. And I know, Dr. Birts, you talked with me about some of the things that you've recently seen that are encouraging. So maybe you can speak a little bit into that as we move to close.
Yeah, I've been following the alumni, the different stories of alumni who are using their voices and talking about how they want to see their alma mater and their schools improve. And that's something I've been paying close attention to, and also just processing what that means for myself and my fellow alumni of color who have been in institutions. I was in high school 20 years ago and dealing with a lot of the stuff that all of your children are dealing with right now, and you probably dealt with, and that person dealt with. So it's one of those things where acknowledging that even with the current sentiment right now, I really hope that it continues past this moment where we are. The conversations and the accountability still starts to happen. But I also think, in addition to hearing non-POCs, white students, other different groups talk about the actions that they want to see, institutions take and so forth, I don't want to forget about the alumni of color voice. And I would even take it a step further to say this is a great opportunity to involve them, but they should be compensated for their time if that's an approach that a school chooses to take. Because some of those solutions, alumni had them years ago. And I just say that to complement what's going on now, not to undermine the voices of generation and the children who are speaking out now, because they should, and it's really great. And I believe a lot can come from it. But I also know that this is still something that people have been saying for a very long time. So it can create an opportunity to bridge these different community and bridge these different voices. But wherever there's an opportunity for alumni to be involved, I just want to say, I don't think this time it should be on a volunteer basis.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know what to say to that, but
I thought a lot about it, actually.
Well, I would love to see how that pans out. What I think about when you talk about the alumni is just the power of collective voices, being able to come together and work together. Those voices were there, but I think when you have something like this, where now you think about protests. There's many different ways to do that. You're out in the street, you're talking, putting pressure, but then you're giving, then you're also organizing, then you're also pooling together your resource and saying, we have an opportunity we're out here. I think it was Valley Christian School where a large group of African-American alumni got together and started to have conversations and actually work with the administration. That's encouraging to me as a parent to say, okay, there's a group here who's standing up now and they're advocating for change. And hopefully by the time my son gets in high school, you know, a few years from now, things will be on the path toward going in a direction where it will be empowering for my child to go to that school, be successful there on that level.
And then when you mention protests, I do want to just speak to people about like different ways of getting involved and to say, don't underestimate the power of checking on your friends in this time, or checking on your colleagues, or checking on the people in your life. Not necessarily always to express how you feel, but to see how they're doing. That's something that when I see Black Lives Matter posted everywhere online, I recognize that that is a form of people speaking and acknowledging things. But I also want to say that it's something to be said about what that means on an individual level. Because I have been in discussion with other, you know, Black people about that particular topic, and it is worthwhile. And I would just leave it there to check on the people that are actually right there around you.
Yes, that's good. And I think that's a great place to come to a close. I hope everyone that is listening currently live or will watch the rebroadcast of this will just take the time to check on your family, check on your friends. We've been in shelter in place in many parts of the country for close to 80 days, right? And so kids are, you know, thankfully we're in the summertime, you know, kids have had a tough time being inside, being online, going through their classes. And then of course, now we're talking about African-American children having another level of pressure and things on top of them right now. So I think it's important to check in with those people that you know who have children, check on them to see how they're doing, how they're navigating the space, what type of summer resources that they have available, getting them together with other children, if you can do that socially, from a socially distanced perspective. But to really continue to build community and find organizations where you can build that community, because within those voices, there are solutions that are there, right? And people can band together to work together to put in place things that can help schools, help students, and help everyone as we move forward. So thank you all once again. Dr. Birts, where can we find more information on you, and then also some resources, maybe some literature that parents can look into, that educators, teachers, people can share out that'll help them more as we go on?
So I'm on Facebook, my Facebook business page, and I'll say it slowly, is Birts Equity and Inclusion Solutions. That's Facebook. You could also find that, find me on Instagram. It's just BEI Solutions LLC. I also have a website where I actually do have a resource page on there that I update of different readings and so forth. But if you were to simply email me, I could send you tons of information. And that's www.deicapacitybuilding.com. And all my information is there. So those are different avenues. And of course, anyone who knows anyone that's a part of this conversation that knows me could also provide you with my email address and my contact information.
And for those who are on Facebook Live, you can just go to my page. I'll also post her information there as well, the website and her page on Facebook. You'll be able to find it and find a lot of those resources. So thank you everybody for joining. I hope this helped someone. It definitely helped me. I hope it provided you with some resources, but more importantly, through these experiences that we were able to share, that you found yourself in those places, and that you can take this information and then help someone else as well. So I'll be back on Instagram or maybe Facebook too next week for another edition of On Purpose Live. We're going to be talking about vision and just a little silent plug. And so Dr. Birts said she'll send some resources out to people in the group, to us, and then we'll share those resources out with everyone else. So thank you all. Have a great, great Thursday. On to a fabulous weekend. Any parting words, Dr. Birts?
I can't express enough how that identity piece is central to starting this work. It's easy to name what other people aren't doing, or, you know, but starting internally and thinking about who am I, what is my role, and where is my privilege, all those type of conversations, that to me, I honestly believe it, and I know that it starts with identity for all of us.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Stay on purpose, and we'll see you soon.